Mud Frontier, Architecture at the Borderlands. Quote, architects do not design walls, but the spaces between them. End quote. Hassan Fatih. An Indo-Hispano man with dark curly hair and medium skin tone digs a hole with a short-handled shovel. Dressed in a red plaid shirt and rubber boots, he digs surrounded by a curved wall made of about 150 layers of dried mud, a freestanding outdoor alcove the size of a shower stall. He steps out of the alcove, then returns with a handful of dry, feathery wildgrass. He puts the wildgrass into the hole, then uses a lighter to start a fire. Soon after, a Caucasian woman with light skin tone and red hair hands him a clay cup, which he adds to a collection gathered in the smoldering fire pit. Outside the alcove, the man grinds kernels of dry corn with a palm-sized rock. He offers the woman the ground corn. She pinches some between her fingers and sprinkles it on the pottery in the alcove fire pit.
Would you like to make an offering, Virginia?
Yes.
Another woman, slightly older than the first, with dark hair and medium light skin tone, takes a pinch and leans into the alcove to sprinkle it over the pottery. Crouching at the entrance to the alcove, the man in the plaid shirt breaks sticks and tucks them between the pieces of pottery. Standing behind him, a young African man with dark skin tone and a gap-toothed smile laughs. Later, he tends to the fire, as does the red-headed woman and a bespectacled young Caucasian man with light skin tone. They gather around the fire with several others. Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum presents in association with Smithsonian Latino Center, featuring Ronald Rael, the man in the red plaid shirt, and Rael San Fratello, the red-headed woman. A vase is designed digitally, then a conical shape is rendered in clay by a 3D printer. Ron hauls a pink teeter-totter to the US-Mexico slatted steel border wall and plays as armed border guards look on. Mud Frontier, Architecture at the Borderlands.
I have always been fascinated in ruins.
Dilapidated buildings sit in a field.
That was my childhood playground. Growing up here in southern Colorado, there were many adobe buildings that melted over time. It was like people just left.
Ron stands in a building full of trash.
As a kid, I would go into these places and just see what they left behind and how weather and the elements started to expose the building itself, and you could see how the buildings were made.
Ronald Rael.
Often people wrote on the beams, and you could see the name of the man who built the house.
Co-founder of Rael San Fratello.
My first architecture education was just playing in abandoned buildings when I was a kid.
He stands at a Harvard lectern.
You would ask me upstairs if I'm from Mexico. I'm not from Mexico, but I do consider myself a Borderlands citizen, but a very different border than the one. My name is Ronald Rael. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, but they take on the language of both the Native American and the Spanish and Mexican architectural typology. I am from the San Luis Valley in Colorado and grew up in the small village of La Florida.
He bikes onto a ranch wearing black overalls.
Historically and culturally, this was the northernmost frontier of the Spanish and later the Mexican Empire. It was largely sheep ranching and cattle ranching. Over the years, it became abandoned. Today, this village is population 6. It's made up of a couple of adobe houses.
He takes off his boots.
My mother's house.
And joins the dark-haired woman in the kitchen.
And the cemetery.
Ron reaches into a cupboard as she rolls tortillas on a cutting board. Later, Ron laughs at the kitchen table. I probably gained an interest in uncovering these histories through buildings by working with my father. Snapshots are shown.
He was a builder.
Christina Casillas Rael.
We would build and fix houses made out of mud. So at a very young age, I was working with him on site.
His father was always buying property and fixing it up and then reselling or whatever. And he always did that, so I knew that Ronald was kind of headed that way.
Ron walks down a vast empty street toward a collection of buildings.
These are the last three remaining pieces of the commercial buildings in Conejos. There's certain importance ascribed to history, important events, important people, but I'm also interested in remembering the things that weren't so important or that were everyday, but that they have a different kind of importance. Everybody knew Mr. Gomez. He had a big family. So I like the idea of remembering him.
He unlocks and opens a door. Plaster peels off the walls and ceiling planks sag overhead.
So what we've done on this building so far is we've gutted it, and now we're going to fix the roof so it doesn't leak anymore. Like most of the buildings, they were flat and they had a dirt roof, and so there's tons of dirt on top. And then over time they build another roof on top of that and leave the dirt. And then now we're in the state where the roof's been abandoned for so long that it not only is it leaking, but it's leaking onto the earth roof, which makes, you can see the mud and so heavy, and then that starts to weigh down, and then, so that's how buildings die around here, but I'm hoping that we can keep this one alive just a little bit longer.
He heads back outside into the harsh sunlight. Later, fluffy white clouds drift past a house in a wild, grassy landscape.
So this is probably the longest I've stayed in La Florida.
Ron drives a four-wheeler down a dirt road.
Since I was maybe in graduate school.
And wears a wide-brimmed straw hat.
I've been spending my summer in my ancestral village.
He digs at the side of the road.
Working on an experiment.
He shovels dirt into a screen atop a trailer, then sifts out the rocks.
Those experiments are about this place, using the materials of this place and the traditions of this place.
He dumps the rocks back onto the road, then returns to the ranch with the four-wheeler and trailer. He backs into a shed and shovels the soil into a blue hopper. Soon after, he pulls a thick, coiled hose from an open bag. The man with dark skin joins him.
Thanks for bringing this along.
My name is Lodgman Arja. I am from Sudan. I went to School of Architecture before I came to Berkeley in Sudan.
Logman pours water into the trailer.
Logman had applied to the architecture program at Berkeley and didn't get in, but came to ask why and to wonder what he could do better when he applies in the future. He was such a smart, interested, and passionate person that we accepted him there on the spot. And he dove right in and became a really important part of the team really quickly.
With bubble wrap lining their work table, they unpack and assemble pieces of equipment.
This is an extension cord
Ron untangles a thick, coiled cable.
that my father left me for this project.
He considers the outlet box on the end of the cable, then scrapes it out with a screwdriver.
I'm totally not superstitious, but I totally am. That's the nature of the modern day Latino, no? You're like a superstitious atheist.
He makes an adjustment with his screwdriver, then plugs the cable into a junction box. He tests the other end with a meter.
Yes, sir. That works. So when I was cleaning up this shed for this project,
he hangs an old saw on the wall.
I started to find some of my dad's old tools, so I started to make this little, call it a shrine on the wall of the tools that I'm finding in the shed, like his welding jacket, fence post driver. I broke my nose once using that.
Ron continues to assemble the equipment, bolting a standing mechanical arm to a sheet of plywood.
In grad school, I was studying modern architecture and digital design. When I was in the library on the side, I would just look up earthen buildings, not only from here, because I was homesick, but all over the world, which I didn't know so much about. I would discover that many of the architects that we consider modern architects,
Photos are shown.
they, at some point in their career, had designed buildings made out of earth. This discovery that earth was in fact a modern material as well as a traditional material really excited me.
Logman joins him at the hopper.
I think that that is a good mixture and that's a good mixture and it's harder, and we mix them together. We can pull it up. Okay. Are we ready, Logman?
They hang a thick hose from the ceiling.
If it looks like we're amateurs, it's because we are amateurs. I was fascinated by the notion that a traditional building construction system can be reimagined in the 21st century.
The hose leads from the mud-filled hopper to the mechanical arm. Moving on its own, the arm deposits a zigzagging line of mud onto the plywood.
Right.
Mud squeezes through the arm's nozzle like thick chocolate frosting from a piping bag.
3D printing comes to La Florida. What do you think, Mom? It's pretty, right?
Looking on, Christina smiles and films with her cell phone. The 3D printing nozzle adds more layers to the zigzagging line.
I guess because I grew up in houses made out of adobe, I feel like you can feel an adobe building and a kind of history that's associated with them. That is not just a local history, but it's a global history. We can trace the word adobe back to the Egyptian word atob. It's the same word, it has the same lineage, and we can think of the same dimensions of a brick that are used in Colorado today, the same dimensions of a brick that were used in Egypt.
An ancient tomb painting is shown.
If you think about the development of civilization, the two things that coincided in our own evolution is that agriculture and the growing of wheat, and discovering that those unused wheat stalks, when they were in the muddy soil, became very hard. And that you could actually stand those up and begin to build walls.
Adobe buildings are constructed in archival footage.
So there are many types of earthen technologies. Two of the most prevalent are adobe and rammed earth.
Adobe mud is pressed into a wood frame.
Adobe is clay and sand and silt mixed with straw and water, dried in the sun. And it's used as a brick that can be stacked, and often stacked in a mortar made out of the same exact material.
A brick is set into a wall.
Rammed earth it's clay that's not very wet, it's only humid, and it's placed between forms, and it's compacted.
Mud is rapidly tamped down.
And prior to colonization by the Spanish, Native Americans would make a kind of adobe, but it's more technically called cob. The Spanish introduced the adobe brick, and then Native Americans adopted that tradition.
A wall is built with buckets of muddy mortar.
Building in adobe is essentially like 3D printing.
Layers of clay squirt through a fine nozzle.
You're just adding mud material layer by layer.
The process is overseen by Virginia San Fratello.
My name is Virginia San Fratello. I was born in Savannah, Georgia. I grew up all over the South, in Savannah, southern Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina.
She unplugs wires on a tabletop version of the 3D printer.
So I'm just going to take apart the 3D printer, this tube here that holds the clay. My undergraduate degree is in environmental design. I didn't start out studying architecture. I think I really loved architecture from the beginning because I realized it would give me an opportunity to work at many different scales.
Cabin of 3D printed curiosities.
So I could work at the scale of the building and think about the form of a building. I could also work at the scale of the hand and think about custom designing interior components.
Photos are shown. Delicate pottery lines a table. In a workshop, Virginia dismantles the smaller clay-caked printer.
Ron was an interesting person to sit next to in architecture school because he lived at his desk. He slept there many nights. He ate there. He made wildly mysterious things at his desk out of materials that the rest of us weren't using in architecture school.
Clay is worked by hand.
Several years after architecture school, we reconnected, and we've been working together since 2003.
In a fast-motion video, Virginia and Ron build an indoor structure with mud.
This summer is special because we're able to merge the things that we do here with the technology that we've been experimenting with in the Bay Area.
On her laptop,
This is the grasshopper script. So we can visualize using these numerical sliders very quickly to design the object that we're going to 3D print.
the tabletop printer keeps working.
For the first time, we're bringing our 3D printers out to the high desert here in Colorado.
On the ranch, Ron climbs into a tractor.
I had no preconceptions of what we were going to do this summer. I just wanted to have a place where I could bring all these factors together and begin to test them. Here, we get to go full on and say, what does it mean to print for 2.5 months straight? And what are the challenges that arrive there?
Dirt hits a screen, separating the soil and the rocks. Logman tosses the dirt, one shovelful at a time. Later, the bespectacled man shovels the sifted soil into a mixing drum.
My name is Sandy Kurth. I go to school at UC Berkeley in a Master's of Architecture program. Growing up, my dad and I used to go dig clay along this bay where he's an oyster farmer. And I would make pinch pots and little hand-built functional pottery out of those things.
He holds straw.
Decided to add it in here, it seems fine. A few months before the end of the semester, Ron brought up that we would be trying to print something out in Colorado, here on his family's land with local material. And I knew that there was a rich adobe history here, that the soil is really good for what we were trying to do.
Mud is dumped from the mixer into a wheelbarrow, and a mixing bar with metal teeth at the bottom of the blue hopper is switched on. Ron and Logman shovel mud into the hopper. Mud pours out of a nozzle. Ron looks on, backed by a big gray sky. Logman watches too.
What do you think, Lugman? Should we set down some layers?
The large 3D printer extrudes mud onto the ground. Ron adjusts the printer nozzle.
The challenges we encountered early on, I mean, there's really challenges on all fronts. There's challenges on material. The material has to be made in such a way that it can work with the machine, so you have to screen it and filter it. Then there are the hardware challenges, everything from the pump to the robot. Like the pump can only pump a certain viscosity of mud, so we have to make the mud that viscosity, and if we exceed that, it might bog down or it might get too hot. And then there's the software issues as well. We've been working on the software for a while, and we've developed it ourselves.
Sandy opens a laptop in the tractor.
But it still has its own glitches, and this robot really is an experimental machine.
The printer builds a curved, layered wall around itself.
It looks at Rasquatchia, I don't know if you know what this word Rasquatchia means. And it's not a word that we use here. We have a similar word, but Rasquatchia was adapted by the Chicano movement as sort of recognizing that you're trying to do the most with the least that you have. And so an example might be, like, sometimes you go to a restaurant, a Mexican restaurant, let's say, and salt shakers are made out of a beer bottle, you know. So you took that beer bottle and turned it into a salt shaker. Now it has value, and you're not ashamed of it. You accept that you're doing the best with the least that you have. Here we have a word kind of similar, say trochimochi, and it's sort of like just ad hoc, but yeah, you get by. And so this is all kind of rasquachi or trochimochi in a way, and everything's working great, which I'm really happy about. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but I'm happy right now that everything's printing.
Nearby, wet mud oozes out of the printer nozzle.
You want to try printing it that wet? And we'll just go really slow and wet, and hopefully it doesn't rain.
Dark clouds roll in.
Weather is also a factor because this robot, it's not necessarily designed to bring to the outdoors, so we had to find ways to weatherproof it and make sure we protect it.
Runny mud pours out of the nozzle. Logman, Ron, I'm going to pause it. It's barely printing anything.
Okay. How much is barely? Let's see.
Gaps appear in the flow of mud.
Oh no. What happened? The coupling is too small. Use the hose to wash it out. But the hose didn't fit in there. No, and I don't understand why. All right, pause it.
Ron reaches for the pump at the front of the hopper. He adjusts a bolt with two big wrenches. Dirty water pours out of the hopper.
It's the hose is plugged.
He catches the water with a bucket and pours it back into the hopper. Ron drapes the thick hose over his shoulders and carries it across the ranch. He flushes out the hose with an outdoor water tap. Later, Ron pushes the hopper with Logman.
I think if I was a bit aggressive about it, I could find a VC who might give me money, build a better robot, we can print this case study. I know that is absolutely the easy thing to do. The more difficult thing to do, I think, is to convince people of the value of a building made out of earth.
Thick mud slowly runs from the nozzle. Ron looks on, hands folded across his stomach.
It's still a problem, but I think there's a rock in there.
Under a blanket of dark clouds, the rusty teal shell of a 1950s cruiser sits in a field. Rain starts to fall, and Ron and Logman cover the 3D printer with a tarp.
I don't know, somehow it became an obsession. Like, why do I have all these adobe houses? I mean, really, when this particular house, my grandparents' house, left my family, I tried very hard to buy it because of the memories that we had here and its history in our family.
An old black and white family photo is shown.
All my life, I had seen houses melt into the landscape. And I have seen in my lifetime the language begin to disappear, and I have seen in my lifetime the people disappear.
Old tools hang on the white shed wall.
And I feel like the houses are some of the last permanent vestiges of the culture, and I thought it was just important to save them.
Thick mud is pumped out of the nozzle.
I think part of the goal here is also to challenge the preconceptions of earth as a building material, and that, in fact, it's possible to 3D print architecture with traditional materials that have been developed for 10,000 years.
Layered concentric arches zigzag around the robotic arm of the 3D printer as Logman and then Sandy prepare more mud nearby. The sun rises over the horizon and birds zip through the hazy peach-colored sky. Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum, 2018.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to talk for 30 minutes about 3D printing with the goals and aspirations of arriving at architectural solutions using that technology. But I wanted to contextualize this a little bit about where I am from because it has implications in thinking about how this work emerges.
A rainbow rises behind distant hills.
I'm from a very particular place in the United States called the Valle de San Luis, which is historically the northernmost frontier of Mexico and the Spanish Empire. This was the border between the United States and Mexico until 1845. During that time, there was a militarization of that border through the construction of military forts and trading posts.
La Florida's buildings are shown.
The architecture of these forts is incredibly interesting to me.
Ron stands in front of a red building.
This I call the Lafayette Head House, and this is the site of one of the earliest settlements in Conejos County.
An historical property map is shown.
It was a much larger compound. It was sort of a fortification that extended 200 feet back to the creek and created a rectangle around a plaza.
Dry grass grows around the dilapidated building.
This is the home of someone named Lafayette Head, and he's an important historical figure.
In an open building full of wood and glass display cases,
I want to welcome you to the Luther Bean Museum. The focus of the museum is really the history, art, and culture of the San Luis Valley and kind of the larger cultural and geographic region.
Ron and the Caucasian female collections manager, Tawny Becker, are joined by Virginia, a preteen boy, and others.
Hello. What's your name?
Matthias.
Matthias.
Matthias, yeah.
This is a selection of objects that we have from Lafayette Head.
Artifacts and images are shown.
He was a soldier in the Mexican-American War and fought in battle in New Mexico. And after the war, settled in Abiquiu, New Mexico, and married an Hispano woman.
Photos are held with gloved hands.
After settling in Abiquiu, he recognized that there was still a Mexican land grant available in Colorado, and he gathered families from Abiquiu to come to Colorado to settle this land grant. He gained some political power and became the first lieutenant governor of the state of Colorado, and he became a Ute Indian agent. And this house, or what remains of it, was the Ute Indian Agency and his lieutenant governor's mansion, as they call it. There's an interview with his nephew, and he's saying, "Oh, my uncle's Head's compound is the most well-built and best-built house in Conejos."
But to me, it's amazing that Victorian, every surface is covered.
Yes, every surface.
And with a different pattern.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, that looks very affluent for this area, especially then.
Ron walks the property.
It was covered in concrete plaster, cement plaster, and that was pretty common for a lot of the buildings in the 50s. But the problem with that is that it doesn't allow the adobe to breathe.
Cracks mar the exterior walls.
Eventually, a lot of these houses started getting wet behind the cement plaster, turning the wall to mud and collapsing. This happened to churches and houses all over Colorado, New Mexico.
Ron heads inside, where boards hang from the ceiling and debris lies on the floor.
Ooh, what a difference, huh? Did you guys come in here before? What a difference. The space feels so much bigger. So most of what I've done is a lot of cleaning.
He drags a mattress out of a window well.
And also, there were years of additions to the surfaces.
He pokes a drop ceiling tile.
And I removed all of that to the historical layers of the house. That's where the ceiling used to be. So I pulled away the ceiling all the way back to the original structure, which is these giant log beams, vigas we call them, which just means beams in Spanish. But
Back outside,
this building was really known for its kind of grandeur as these various headquarters. I think it's important to maintain that aspect of the history of this house.
Can you tell us what this building is?
Ron turns to a smaller gray adobe building.
So, this is a continuation of this house that would have wrapped the entire courtyard. Oral history tells us that this was the slave quarters for this compound.
In an archival photo of a living room, a woman stands in the background.
It sort of makes sense architecturally because it had a very grand front where you welcomed guests, a very long porch that maybe was the place where Indians could gather but not enter into the house. And as you go further back, usually there's the servants' quarters.
The buildings are highlighted on the property map.
My cousin Esteban is an expert on this, and he can talk more about that.
My name is Esteban Rael Galvez, and I am the former state historian of New Mexico and the former senior vice president at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I can't wait to see.
He leads Ron into another building.
I first encountered Lafayette Head when I was doing research for my dissertation on slavery. He occupies it. So as I walk into this house, and I walked into it before, but as you've started to pull back these layers, I'm just so amazed. But I want to know, where are these vigas from?
Right.
Right? Tracing the architecture of slavery, Lafayette Head didn't build this house.
Right.
This was built by slave labor.
Later, people gather outside.
Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. So we are standing on a very important historical site, and what's interesting about this particular place, Conejos, is that it was founded by the residents of Abiquiu. And Abiquiu, New Mexico, was what's called a Genízaro town. Genízaro is a word to describe indigenous people who have been stripped of their Native American ancestry through slavery and become Hispanicized.
A stern group gathers in an archival photo.
I'll share one story that was told to me by a man named Demetrio Valdez, who grew up in the section of the building here that no longer exists.
My name is Demetrio Valdez, and I'm 72 years old, and I lived in Conejos County all my life.
He said that his grandfather mentioned that one day Apaches came with Navajo children in front of the church, and they called out to the priests and said, "Would you like to buy these children?"
And the priest came out and said, "No, we are not slave traders. We will not buy them." So the Apaches just killed all the orphans right in front of everybody. So the next time they brought orphans, the priest said, "Yeah, we can't let these kids die. Give them whatever they want."
And so the priests would buy the children, and they distribute them amongst the families in the community through adoption. And they would become baptized Catholic, and they would become Hispanicized, and they would grow up in the families as servants of the families, but also as family, because they grew up since they were infants. And they would marry into the community as well. And this is the legacy of this community that exists here.
Esteban.
Basically, these individuals were captured mostly as very young children. Most of them were women. They began to be raised in these families, and going back home was not an option necessarily. They had been so severed from their natal community.
Lafayette Head had a number of these children that he baptized, and while he was the main person who documented all of the slaves that were held by families in this area, he never documented his own.
This is one of the most incredible documents. He lists the baptismal name of these captured Native Americans. He lists the name of the owner, and he uses the word owner. He lists where purchased, of whom purchased, and when purchased.
Formal handwriting fills a ledger.
For me, I guess I resist the glorification and even the telling of the story of Lafayette Head too much, because we have those stories already. And what we don't have is a story of Alejandro Head, the indigenous person that lived in that compound and maybe carved the vigas, who maybe mudded the building. And we don't have the story of my great-great-great-grandmother, Manuelita Cisneros. She was
He swallows hard.
She was a matriarch of my branch of the Rael family that lived in Abiquiu. She was taken when she was about 5 years old. She was baptized as Cisneros. That wasn't her name. we will never know her name. And that's part of the story of slavery anywhere, and certainly true here. If Ronald and I could use Lafayette Head so that we can tell those stories, that's what I want to do.
I now own this property, and I'm working with a number of people, many of who are here in the audience today, to think about the future of this site, archaeologically, historically, culturally, architecturally. And I also hope that the way it's restored allows us to make new things. Like, it's just not a frozen thing in time that says, there, we preserved it, read about Head and all the things that he did, but instead, it's part of an evolving thing that propels creativity and knowledge, that gives birth to culture rather than mark its death.
The gathered crowd heads inside and explores the dilapidated building.
I think creative responses are also ways to measure an evolving moral that one has about a place, right? Because even in the conversation I've had over the last 2 years or so about the Head House and Indigenous slavery, I see how the morals are shifting from, like, oh, there was never any slavery, to, oh, that's not slavery, that is tradition, to, oh yes, there was slavery, to now I think, like, oh, we were those slaves.
Ron shakes a man's hand.
All of us who are from here are indigenous to this landscape. And so whether in the capacity of being a descendant of someone who was a slave or descendant of someone who held a slave, those are the ways that we are connected to that past.
At the ranch, Ron shows others his 3D printer.
So I'm learning a lot from place, from the things that I'm finding here, the conversations I'm having with people.
More layers are added to the zigzagging rows.
I think I'm connecting more with my indigenous ancestry and my traditional ancestry. It's something that maybe I haven't done since I was a kid, and I see the indigenous technologies that gave life to this in the first place.
He pats the mud on the now chest-high wall. In archival footage, a woman sculpts a clay pot by hand.
The origin of the Pueblo people go back, as my grandmother would have said, when the rocks were soft. So the origin story tells of all of these communities. There used to be hundreds, and they were all interconnected, but all speaking different languages, Tewa, Keres, from Zuni, Hopi Pueblos that continue to dot the landscapes in Arizona and New Mexico, to as far north as Taos.
In the museum's storage room,
It's a rather small museum, but we have quite an eclectic collection. So we have some really wonderful examples of the Pueblo pottery.
Becker wears white gloves.
And this is a Santa Clara pitcher.
We don't know the exact history, but could be a potter from both heritage of Santa Clara and the Hispano influence.
The red-handled pitcher sits on a table.
Okay, so this is one of the Picarillas pots.
Wow.
Virginia leans in close.
And so what makes it gold?
So that's the micaceous clay from northern New Mexico.
The gold clay sparkles in the fluorescent light.
They seem so precious, but it's amazing that they were just used.
I know. Like, I think they're great to show students because obviously you see their vessels, but they've sort of lost that connection a little bit to use.
Ron nods. Estevan.
There used to be hundreds of these pueblos across the landscape in what is now known as northern New Mexico. There are 19 pueblos left.
Ron drives through the country with Virginia.
So the effect of conquest and colonialism was, in one way of thinking about it, devastating. And yet, at the same time, to be able to say that there are 19 pueblos and that they are thriving is pretty special. You don't have that in many parts of the nation, where people can touch a wall, as you can in Taos Pueblo, and say, My people have lived here for thousands of years.
Boxy, multi-story adobe buildings are shown in archival footage. Johnny Ortiz and Afton Love.
And I try to leave some sand because the clay, when it has more grit, doesn't warp as much. So to make plates and stuff, I need like just the perfect amount of sand, and for it to not warp, but for it to not break.
Right.
It's softer. It's almost like waxier or something. Yeah. That's what he uses for his plate. It's almost what you use exclusively now.
Yeah.
He rubs a lump of shimmering clay.
Johnny hosts these dinners in a project that he does called Shed, where he's the chef and he harvests local foods and presents them to a group over the span of several hours.
We initially debated on taking you to the Taos spot or the La Madera spot.
Yeah.
And this is the Taos clay. But it works a lot better for coil building. So you're thinking that the 3D printing the coil, it's pretty much a coil building, so I think this one will work.
Then I can print with it this afternoon.
There you go.
So cool.
Take it in the morning, print with it in the evening.
They leave the workshop and drive off with a dog in the back of their pickup truck.
I grew up in Taos, on the Taos Pueblo. Most of my ancestors were native to this area.
Johnny digs.
We'll take a shovel and we'll just go around the perimeter on the inside and just scoop a little bit out and see if there's a spot that looks better than others.
He shows Ron a clump of clay.
And that's it's just more of the pure clay. But look, you can see the paint.
Just pure mica, basically.
Pure mica, and then you got like some of the rose quartz probably, and then some of that sandstone.
He breaks the clump in two and gives half to Ron.
All of these 3D printers and these labs around the world are so clean, and you have the technology and the equipment there, you buy the materials, and to be able to like forage for or harvest your own materials and get out into the landscape and take it out of that kind of pristine environment, I think is the ultimate goal.
Mexico, there's still that underlying kind of prejudice. And so, people at the Pueblo tend to be Pueblo. People outside of Pueblo tend to be Hispanic.
Yeah.
So it's changing a little bit.
They continue digging and examine a shovelful.
Isn't that pretty?
Yeah.
It's a tradition when you're digging clay to bring something to say thank you to the ground, the earth, to the clay that's being made under our feet. And this is definitely someone who's been making pottery out of this clay and then coming back and breaking it ceremoniously to say thank you.
Afton points to pottery shards scattered on the ground.
Like you leave for college, and like I also left when I was around 19, and then you leave, and then you're just not connected to all of this for a while.
They hang out beside their trucks.
So I have to remember all this.
It's good to have you back.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to be back.
Bushy green trees blanket the area. Later, back at the ranch, Virginia dumps a bucket of clay and dirt onto a sheet of blackened steel.
So I just want to process it by breaking it up into very small pieces and letting them dry here in the sun, probably for the rest of the day.
She tamps it down and breaks it up with a shovel.
I think the thing that resonates with me most is the material and the kind of haptic qualities of the material. So the way it feels when I touch it.
In the workshop,
I like to think about the way this bowl fits in my hand perfectly, or whether it's hot or cold, or soft or warm.
at the ranch, she adds water to the finely ground soil to create smooth clay.
So this is the clay after it's been sitting for a little while and the water's evaporated out. And this would be really good for 3D printing with. Ron, Ron, come look at our wild clay.
Which one is that?
That's the heavily micaceous clay.
Oh, wow.
Using their fingers, They mix a small batch in a glass baking pan.
So this is a piece of 3D printed micaceous clay pottery, and I'm coating it with the wild micaceous clay that we harvested from northern New Mexico.
In the workshop,
When I design buildings, I think about those same haptic qualities.
she mixes more clay.
I think about space, but I think the way material affects us is probably more important to me and the thing that I think about first.
She packs clay into a tube the size of an arm. When she bangs it on the table, tendrils of clay emerge from holes drilled near the base. Another time, the tabletop 3D printer begins to move. A cat sits nearby beside Virginia's laptop. Virginia rubs a disc of clay extruded by the printer. The printer builds up thin layers, creating a brown clay bowl. Elsewhere, an axe is sharpened on a grinding wheel. Matthias makes sparks, holding the axe to the grinding wheel.
This was my grandfather's office. He called it La Oficina. And he had a wood stove here. After a day of chopping wood and feeding the cows and everything, to come in and sit here on the chair and have a little whiskey. Chopping wood out there, I just remembered, I said, oh, my grandpa used to have a sharpening stone back there. I wonder if it's still there. And so we dug it up and we plugged it in, and sure enough, it still works.
Oh yeah, it's pretty sharp.
Now you're a man, son.
They slip outside through a door blocked by tall grass.
It's always exciting to have Matthias be a part of the project.
He raises the axe and chops a piece of wood.
For this most recent structure that we're 3D printing, Matthias has been chopping the palitos, or the little wood sticks that make the fur.
Sandy.
We were thinking about the idea of making furry architecture, which is something Ron and Virginia have been sketching and modeling for quite some time. Basically, each stick goes through the inner wall and the outer wall, and then creates this nice aesthetic furriness, while also tying together the structural system.
The foot-long sticks poke out of the round structure's exterior. Logman.
One of the design inspirations for this structure would come from West African architecture, the likes of architecture that we've seen it in Mali and Cameroon.
Photos show large adobe buildings studded with wooden sticks.
Just always point the sticks. We can take on structural problems, we can do these sorts of things, but sometimes the artistic experiments lead us into directions that become really useful, but they're useless in the beginning.
Ron places sticks on the structure's top layer.
Time is running out fast.
The printer continues working in the dark.
We have to head to El Paso and Juarez, and we only have 4 more days to print this structure, to clean and pack everything up.
Sandy sits in the tractor, and Ron stands with the printer.
We might be printing to the last minute.
The round studded structure continues to grow in fast motion through the night and into the next day. In the workshop, the small printer creates a conical vessel as Virginia works at her laptop.
I think one of the most exciting things for me about this whole process is that we can 3D print local clays and sands to make walls and enclosures.
She stands atop an outdoor staircase.
We can make other architectural components such as stairs. We can make interior components such as furniture and hearths.
She sits in an alcove with Ron.
And we can also use those same clays to 3D print vessels that can be used in the interior as well.
Ron pulls pottery from a fire.
These are the micaceous clay cookware. This is a bean pot, and it has a lid. This is a tagine, and plates and bowls. When it's fired, you have something strong that lasts forever, and it's not plastic. It also feels good.
She strokes the weave-like exterior of a carafe.
So we're talking about architecture, furniture, and objects, all made out of the same materials, using the same technology.
She poses at the open entrance of the stick-studded structure. At the end of the summer, Ron and Virginia make plans to carry out a time-sensitive project on the U.S.-Mexico border. Ciudad Juarez, Mexico.
Isn't it fascinating how the simple act of drawing a line on the map can transform the way we see and experience the world?
In a TED Talk.
And how those spaces in between lines, borders, become places. And those lines drawn on a map can actually create scars in the landscape, and they can create scars in our memories. My interest in borders came about when I was searching for an architecture of the borderlands.
Tents pack the property outside a border office.
You might be familiar with this well-known traffic sign. It was designed by graphic designer John Hood, a Native American war veteran working for the California Department of Transportation. And he was tasked with creating a sign to warn motorists of immigrants who were stranded alongside the highway and who might attempt to run across the road.
3 silhouetted figures.
And he was very careful in thinking about using a little girl with pigtails, for example, because he thought that's who motorists might empathize with the most. And he used the silhouette of the civil rights leader, Cesar Chavez, to create the head of the father. Hood related the plight of the immigrant today to that of the Navajo during the Long Walk.
Tonight, an unusual display at the border. He is getting lots of attention. You'll see why.
The teeter-totter wall is the brainchild of 2 Bay Area professors, one here at UC Berkeley, another at San Jose State. They say the project is a decade in the making, and it was installed and dismantled in one day.
The wall is not only dividing places, it's dividing people, it's dividing families. And the unfortunate politics of the wall is today is dividing children from their parents.
Ron and others carry pink teeter-totters to a slatted steel border wall.
As Noam Chomsky describes it, it's an architecture of violence.
They slip them halfway through the wall.
So what does it mean to walk into the space of violence?
Children sit on the teeter-totter seats
and attempt to disempower it.
They begin to play, teeter-tottering through the border wall, sharing a play structure with a Mexican girl, Virginia Beams.
This is a place where people live.
Drone footage captures people playing and taking pictures on both sides of the border.
But I think it's artists that allow one into those spaces and allow one to see them in different ways.
2 armed Mexican soldiers approach.
To understand that within those spaces of violence, life must continue, and what is life without joy?
Through the slats of the wall, Ron and Virginia share a kiss. Later, Ron sits in the back of a pickup truck, grinning contentedly.
I wanted to build upon the brilliance of this sign to call attention to the problem of child separation at the border, and I made one very simple move. I turned the families to face each other.
The silhouetted girl runs toward the adults.
Because there's a long history of indigenous slavery in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. My family is part of that history. When I think of that sign of Reunite, that little girl is a little girl who is suffering the problems of child separation today, but that little girl is also our grandmothers who suffered those same issues 150 years ago. Gentle, because this paint is, I think that's good, Hito. That's good.
Matthias dusts a framed black and white wedding photo.
This is my great-grandmother, Marina, and my great-grandfather, Miguel Francisco Varela.
If you look here, his hand looks a lot darker than her hand.
Yes, he's very dark.
I think she's wearing a glove, though.
Oh.
She is wearing a glove, right?
Okay.
But she was very fair. My grandma Marina, I knew her.
Christina, Ron, and Matthias pose with the photo.
Matthias loves coming to Colorado. He loves visiting his grandmother. He feels very comfortable here.
He chops wood and drives the four-wheeler with Ron.
Part of me thinks that that's because this place is embedded in his DNA. His ancestors have lived here for 11 generations, and I think he can't help but feel at home here.
He shares a laugh with Ron, then walks along a dirt road with Ron and Virginia.
This was the Spanish cemetery for La Florida that served the community of La Florida and Lobatos. And this is where my family's buried.
Ron stands beside a Rael gravestone.
I'm related to many of the people who are in this cemetery, but this particular section here is mostly my mom's family and also my father's buried here. This is my father's gravestone here, Miguel Arturo Rael.
A list of names and dates is engraved on the back.
And I thought that for Matias, he's the last boy who holds this name, and so in a sense it's kind of a gift to him also, that I thought if he ever wanted to know his own history, it wouldn't be lost in some computer file or in some piece of paper that burned down, but it would be etched in stone.
Matias reads the names with Ron and Virginia. Then they visit another gravestone. On the ranch, several slightly tapered, tube-like adobe structures stand in a cluster. Less than a year after Teeter-Totter Wall, Ron and Virginia returned to La Florida, earlier than expected.
Last summer, the structures that we made were our first experiments building something the height of the printer.
We circled a stick-studded structure, and Ron carries a cast iron pot to an outdoor adobe oven.
We left the Bay Area sooner than we would have because the semester went entirely online. So the pandemic has, I guess it allowed us to do a project bigger than we had ever done before. This summer, we put that all together. The new thing is we're printing much taller, and then we're printing faster by using a rail.
3 silo-like structures stand in a row. A wooden track supports the 3D printing arm, passing through doorways that link the 3 silos.
This is our first experiment where we're really thinking about legitimate doors and windows, and it's matured to the extent that now we're building something that's closer to a building than last year.
Lintels support the windows and doors.
Logman and Sandy, they've both graduated and they're moving on with their lives. It's hard, you build relationship, you build projects, you build a bit of history, and then they go on to make their own histories. Sandy's now pursuing his PhD at MIT, and Logman is pursuing one of the projects that was part of being here.
In the workshop,
he's been working on developing a cook stove that is smokeless. I guess we're working on it together.
And then there would be no escape of heat. Also, the thermal property of the clay itself.
To produce several thousand or even 100,000 of these stoves to distribute to people in West Africa, starting in Sudan, in his home country.
Sitting at a table of clay pots and vessels, Logman smiles.
Do you feel a connection to your dad when you do this kind of work?
I mean, if my dad was here, he would definitely be contributing. Because when I was working on these projects, even though he had worked all day, he would show up and he'd say, okay, I'm gonna do the wiring on this house, or let's plaster this house, or I'm gonna haul stones, or you have to go to college now, so I'm gonna finish it for you.
Virginia lines a floor with smooth stones and adobe candle holders.
And so I imagine if he was here today, one, he'd be amazed by the printer, but he'd probably be out there shoveling dirt and loading it in the printer. I think he'd like seeing this process.
Christina sits inside by a fire.
The name of this project is called Casa Covida, and it's named that because it's the house for cohabitation. There's a bathtub for 2.
Recessed in the ground.
There are 2 benches around a hearth.
The tapered ceilings remain open.
2 beds, so you can look at the sky. It's also a house that we constructed during the time of COVID.
Ron takes pictures of people in the structure. They cuddle in the bed and soak in the tub.
I have traditionally shared a lot of things on social media. And people have come here after they've seen it on Instagram.
He pulls the pot from the outdoor oven.
Some are clay artists, ceramic artists.
He serves a group.
Some people are architects, interested in architecture. Some are interested in earth building. There are archaeologists and historians and journalists.
At dusk, they eat at an outdoor table.
Even just friends locally who come and see this, and that's connecting me more to the place as well and opening up new conversations about all the things that this work is about being here in a historic borderland, the traditions of this place as they change over time.
Ron sits by the fire.
We're living here and it's alive. This house is part of us now.
The sun sets in the distance, silhouetting Casa Covida against the soft purple sky. A film by Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum. Directed by Chris J. Gauthier. Featuring Ronald Rael, Virginia San Fratello. Produced by Cristina L. De Leon, Chris J. Gauthier, Micah Pegues.
Welcome, everyone, to La Florida, Colorado. This is a village that my family's lived in for 7 generations, and this is behind me, Casa Covida. It's a house for cohabitation that we built now during the time of COVID when we relocated here to my ancestral village.
Edited by Storyhouse Films, Chris J. Gauthier.
And so I thought that I would first give you a little tour before the sun goes down of Casa Covida.
Executive producers, Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum, Smithsonian Latino Center, Pamela Horn, Cristina L. De Leon. Cinematography by Chris J. Gauthier, Micah Pegues. Sound design and mix by Greg Smith. Collaborators, Ronald Rael, Virginia San Fratello, Matthias Rael, Cristina Casillas Rael, Logman Arja, Sandy Kurth, Demetrio Valdez, Dr. Esteban Rael Galvez, Tawny Becker. Audio descriptions and captioning by Prime Access Consulting. This film is dedicated to the enslaved Indigenous men, women, and children who were forcibly separated from their land and communities. May their stories continue to be uncovered and told. This film received federal support from the Latino Initiatives Pool, administered by the Smithsonian Latino Center. The views and opinions expressed in this film are those of the contributors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy opinion of Smithsonian Institution. Some of the stories and views expressed in this film cannot be confirmed as historically accurate, but were used to justify the enslavement of Indigenous people.
The hearth space, the bathing space, and the sleeping space. And that is this beautiful view out into the field through this window.
Lifting his laptop off the hood of a pickup truck, Ron carries us to Casa Covida. A video of Casa Covida in the snow appears on Ron's laptop. Snow blankets the ground and the exterior ridges of the 3D printed structure.
And one final view from just a week ago. A week ago? Yeah, this was a week ago. It seems really crazy because it's so nice and sunny and warm right now, but just a week ago we had this crazy snowfall of close to a foot.
Inside, the fire continues to burn, and a snow-dusted cat sits on one of the benches.